And now I'd like to take an opportunity to invite onto the stage the folks that really take good care of the entire community, Mano and Jenny.
The Docker community has been at the heart of Docker's success from the very start. Whatever your role, you are the ones building and running the software that is running the world. In the last 5 years, this practitioner community has grown amazingly. Not only do we have millions of users, we now have 240 regional user groups in over 80 countries, representing over 200,000 people.
Within the community, there are about 60 individuals who have taken their passion for Docker technology to another level by becoming the creators of content and projects to teach others. 3 years ago, we recognized this group as the Docker Captains. This prolific group has taught over 500,000 people across 148 countries. Now, there is one captain in particular whose activities this past year have elevated us all. This person was nominated by their peers because their contributions and leadership served as an example of what it means to be a Docker captain. So, the 2018 Tip of the Captain's Hat Award goes to Mr. Brett Fisher. Congratulations. All right, so your fellow captains have put together a video explaining why they nominated you, and we're going to play that now.
He is involved in the community, actively doing AMA sessions, open to help other captains, and an all-around great example for captains and community members.
Brett's done incredible work with Docker training. He does live hackathons, Q&As, interviews, and more. He helps drive improvements for both the open source and enterprise products at Docker. Cheers, Brett.
He does an amazing job sharing knowledge through videos and conferences. He also provides code for the different Docker components. Our most important value as captains is our ability to educate people to use Docker in the right way. And Brett does this well.
What can I say about Brett Fisher? He's an invaluable resource, not just for other captains, but for the community as a whole. He's accessible and constantly working on sharing knowledge with the community and the other captains. Way to go, Brett.
All right, here you go. Here's your award. On behalf of the captains, Docker, and the community, thank you for all that you do.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. Take a picture?
Good day there, YouTube and container fans. Welcome to my channel. This is a new channel, and if you're here and you followed me a couple weeks ago, I actually shifted to a dedicated DevOps and container channel. So make sure you subscribe, click the video, the button, the like, the little bell that tells you all the things when I go live so that you get these in the future. Because if you're in the DevOps and containers, that's what I'm talking about here every week on YouTube. So you just saw a quick video of me at DockerCon receiving an award. I'm very honored and happy to have received that. So this is what it looks like. It's the first year they're doing this for captains. So in case you didn't know, Docker has a program not only for community leaders, which are largely meetup organizers, and there's now hundreds of those, as you saw in the video. There's also a small group of us that sort of take it to the next level, and we speak about containers and Docker technology, and we do just stuff on the internet, basically helping everyone as much as we can. And this year they voted, or we voted, for our sort of the captain that we thought deserved an award. So I don't know if we're going to be doing that every year, but that was a very special surprise. I had no idea it was happening, so it was sort of cool to find it out about 60 seconds before it actually got announced. I was roughly about a minute ahead of what was happening, but it was a lot of fun. DockerCon EU was in Barcelona this year, and beautiful city. My first time to Barcelona, so that was really a fantastic trip, and I'm looking forward to going there again. Actually, KubeCon, which is also going on this week, is going to be there in the spring, so we'll see. Maybe I'll be able to see that again. So On this channel, we talk about, well, it's just me right now, but I have guests, so I guess when I'm lucky enough to have some guests on this channel, we talk about Docker, but not just Docker. We talk about a lot of container stuff these days, cloud native. Kubernetes is obviously a huge deal. And now we've got so much more to talk about because KubeCon, if you've paid attention on the internet and you're into containers, there was 8,000 people that are today actually meeting for, I'm not sure what KubeCon this is, but for years now, KubeCon has been growing. I think it's only like 3 years old, and they're already at 8,000 people in attendance, which is kind of crazy. So it's both Kubernetes conference and Cloud Native conference. It's run by the Linux Foundation, and we'll get to some announcements and news stuff later. But it's just amazing to see how crazy fast that has grown, in sort of following in the footsteps of Docker and how fast that's grown. So on this channel, in this Ask Me Anything, the way we do this is you get to ask questions. I answer them in order, and I usually start this hour with some stuff that's going on, some projects I'm working on, general news stuff that's relevant, or at least something that I'm interested in, and hopefully that you are. And then we get to your questions, and I try to give you the best answers in 60 seconds or less. Usually I sort of ramble on some things, but the goal here is to get you moving forward in your cloud learning and your container learning. Maybe you're taking one of my courses. Maybe you're just finding this channel because you saw this tweet on the internet, and you can check out my courses. There's some links in the description. I sell 2 courses right now, one on Docker and one on the Swarm Orchestrator. Getting ready to release Docker for Node.js. That's something that I'm working on every day right now. And then that will be followed up with my much anticipated Kubernetes course that everyone keeps asking about, and that I'll be releasing hopefully early next year. We don't have a release date yet, but that's coming soon. I've been working on that for the last several months, and I'm very excited because this stuff is being talked about everywhere. Every conference I go to, people are talking about not just containers, but also now orchestration, service mesh, these higher levels of abstraction that, depending on how fast you're moving in this crazy world of containers and cloud technology, you might be into that stuff. Now, if you're new, that's fine too. You start from the ground up. You learn containers and Docker first, which is why I started with those courses, right? And then you are eventually going to realize that multiple servers in production are more difficult to handle when you're running a whole bunch of different apps and containers. So then you might consider something like orchestration, which is now Kubernetes, Swarm. There's a couple other ones. Nomads is a popular one. Mesos, or Mesosphere, DCOS. That's the same thing, really. And you have to make a choice there. Everybody today is talking about Kubernetes, but an interesting thing that happened at DockerCon again was there's definitely a growing group of people that think Kubernetes is really cool tech, but they don't need all that advanced functionality. They don't need to deploy that level of sophistication. And so something like Swarm or Nomad is a more focused and simpler application orchestration system for containers, and that might fit the bill. And so there's actually at DockerCon, because obviously Docker makes Swarm, so you'll have more Swarm people there. A consistent feedback that I kept getting was, thank you so much for the Swarm information. I'm glad I checked it out because it's meeting my needs, and I don't yet need to do Kubernetes, which tends to be more work, more effort to not just deploy, but also manage, just because it has so many more, knobs to turn, right? So Swarm is more focused. It has less of a feature set than Kubernetes. So you might want to try Swarm first. In fact, that's how I teach my courses and my workshops, is getting you the concepts of orchestration and multi-container management with something like Swarm. And if you then need something on top of that that's even more advanced than what Swarm can do for you, you should check out Kubernetes. A lot of people, maybe because they're reading stuff on the internet, are jumping to Kubernetes right away, and it's cool tech to learn, but I don't necessarily advise that in my consulting practice, and also with my students. It's a lot to learn all that right up front when you're just getting started on containers. So I try to take people slow, start out with Docker, just containers on one server. Then we eventually learn Swarm. And then on top of that, you can take those same concepts and just it's different buzzwords, different terminology, but it's the same concepts. And you can learn Kubernetes on top of that. And maybe someday you'll be doing Kubernetes in the cloud. You'll be running one of the Kubernetes vendors. One of the big announcements this week that came out of KubeCon was one of my favorite cloud hosters, DigitalOcean, generally released their Kubernetes solution, which they've been working on for months, and I was part of the beta. And it was really interesting to see how they're going to make this easy, because that's what DigitalOcean does, right? They don't sponsor this podcast or anything, but maybe they should, because I'm a big fan and I mention them all the time. For smaller projects, for smaller teams, or even solo DevOps people, I think DigitalOcean has definitely found a sweet spot. Same thing with people that are really into web hosting solutions like Heroku. Heroku sort of won the hearts of a lot of web developers when they really just need to manage some web apps on their own. They don't have a whole team to deal with it. And I think that DigitalOcean does that same thing for servers now. So they keep adding new functionality. This year, I think, is the year we saw load balancers come to DigitalOcean. We have now block storage so that I can move my persistent storage around. So it's really slowly adding all those features. And of course, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles of AWS or Azure, but it's also way easier to use. So I use it a lot in my demos just because it provides me the same basic functionality of something more advanced like AWS, but it's super easy to use. The command line is very easy to use. Writing little scripts is easy. And so I generally use it. And then, of course, for my clients, I tend to just help them with whatever they're running on Azure or AWS or DigitalOcean. So go check that out. There's actually links in my courses for DigitalOcean free signups, but now you can get Kubernetes and it doesn't cost you anything. It's crazy. Like, it doesn't cost you anything extra to run Kubernetes. So in the background on DigitalOcean, if you run some containers and you decide that you want to do them in orchestration, you just need to set up your deployments and your YAML files, and you can use the standard Kubernetes command line stuff, kube control, and other things to talk to DigitalOcean's Kubernetes. And right now, they're not stating that they're going to have minimums, but they might have a sort of a minimum setup, maybe 2 or 3 servers that you have to have in order to use Kubernetes. But they're not charging you for the Kubernetes servers running the management and the manager cluster, the masters. And that's crazy, because for a lot of us that set up our own clusters, that's a lot of infrastructure. You know, we've got to have redundancy, so we usually have to have at least 3 servers just to manage the cluster. So DigitalOcean takes care of all that for you. And it's similar to EKS and other things that are happening in Azure and AWS too. It's just easier. So check that out. That was a big announcement this week from one of the companies that I'm a big fan of. Since it's KubeCon this week has dozens and dozens of announcements. Every company that's doing cloud native tech announced something. And I'm not going to go through all that because you can just read the internet. That's probably a much better way of doing it, because I would be boring to listen to for an hour talking about news. So we're going to be a few minutes now before I get to the questions. So let me show you a couple things real quick that I want to talk about. All right. So first up, if you're new here, I talk about my resources. I try to keep everything Docker in one place so that it's a jumping off point for the things that I'm working on or that I've created or that I'm a fan of. And so you can get that over at brettfisher.com/Docker. And I will actually put this in chat so that you can check that out later if you haven't. I'm sure that as I release the Kubernetes course and provide more Kubernetes specific information, I'll probably create that URL as well. But for now, since I started out focusing on Docker and Swarm, that's that stuff there. And you can definitely get notified for all my new courses by signing up for the newsletter. So you can either click on the newsletter at the top or in the list down here under my node.js course that's coming. And you'll get a coupon for that course when it comes out, when it's released on Udemy. I do plan on the Kubernetes course also being on Udemy. They've been a great platform, I think, to create content and get it to the masses, because there's just so many people there, and it gets you a great deal because you're able to get courses at a really good price. So win for everybody, right? So a couple of the things that just happened. DockerCon was last week in Barcelona. I have several videos in this channel, including one from Barcelona last week that you can watch, where we talk about some of the announcements, some of the open source stuff. So I'm not necessarily going to cover all that again here, just later check out this channel's videos. There's only a couple since this is a new channel, and you can watch that stuff from there. So Docker just released their videos. So in case you couldn't make it to Barcelona, you can watch a lot of the videos. You don't get to watch the workshops, unfortunately, because they didn't record those, but you get to watch all the sessions. So if you just go to dockercon.com, and then I'm actually not sure if this link will work. So you have to sign up to get access to the videos. But my video's in here somewhere from my session on Swarm. And there's lots of videos here that I haven't even watched yet because, you know, when I'm at DockerCon, I'm usually hanging out with other people learning, and I'm not able to spend so much time in sessions because I'm catching up with friends. And so I leave the sessions, a lot of them, for later and watch them after the conference. And that's what I'll be doing in the next couple of weeks, is going through the black belt sessions, which are the deep dives into different Docker technologies. And there was at least 30 sessions on Kubernetes. So even though KubeCon is going on this week, if you're not at KubeCon, then you're going to see some of those videos coming out in the coming weeks. But until then, you can check out the DockerCon videos on Kubernetes and how that stuff works. So I keep mentioning this thing called KubeCon, in case you're not familiar. Similar to DockerCon, it's focused on containers, but it's grown to be an industry-wide event. And I think there was a graph somewhere that just showed the growth of how many people are signing up and going to this conference. It's now, I think, like double of last year. It's almost 8,000 people, which is insane. There's only a few of the conferences that I've ever been aware of in tech that are that big, including AWS's reInvent. I used to go to Microsoft's events that were anywhere between 10 and 20,000 people. And when they get to that size, it's basically impossible to even find your friends. So I hope that KubeCon doesn't grow so big that it becomes another reInvent where it is in multiple hotels and you basically don't see anyone you know, and it's just really like being in an amusement park. I like the smaller, more intimate, accessible conferences, but who knows? Maybe KubeCon can keep it fun, keep it manageable, where we can all hang out and have fun. I wasn't able to make it this year because I was coming off of multiple trips, and DockerCon was just last week, and I this close to the holidays, I just couldn't do another conference. So hopefully next year. The other thing I want to mention is, in case you're not super savvy on all this new stuff, Cloud Native Computing Foundation is a nonprofit that tries to manage all this stuff that we're dealing with now in terms of open source and cloud and container technologies. And so, you know, Docker's in there, the Kubernetes project's in there, and there's now dozens, if not hundreds of other projects in there. And I'll be honest, it's a little bit of FOMO of being able to catch up on all this stuff. There's just so much stuff here that no one person can know it all. And so don't feel like you need to go in here and know it all. They actually have so much stuff going on and so many projects now that we're managing inside of the CNCF, that they now have an interactive landscape guide to help you find the tools and projects that you want to use in your own apps and your own technology and your own infrastructure. So go check that out. That's at cncf.io. And they now have this sort of interactive database of looking at different projects. And it's a lot of stuff. And so I myself cannot keep up. There's just no way for me to be an expert on all, even, you know, a dozen of these tools. And so we all have to learn from each other. And I'm excited that this stuff is now getting focused on in one area, and that we don't have to maybe scrounge Google in the internet for maybe what's the latest open source that we can use on our tooling and what works well together. So I'm really excited to see that we're going to hopefully have a community grow out of this, where we'll have different YouTube channels for different focused topics, and people will hopefully start talking more and sharing more about these tools and not just doing blog posts. Because, you know, hey, this YouTube stuff is kind of fun. All right, so that's really all I have in terms of announcements. I've been talking for weeks about my Node.js course, and I won't go into that more in depth, but like I said, you can sign up on the newsletter. So we've got a growing list of questions in the chat, and I will get to those. and we'll see if I can answer all of them today. Hopefully, you're giving me some easy questions as well as some hard ones. And let's get started. All right. So I'm going to read them from the top down in order, and I actually got to change my YouTube live chat. And if I mispronounce your name, apologies. I'm not always good at names. So, good morning, M. This is Mark. Just saying hi and listening in. Great. Thanks for being here. Bill is saying love the random dog videos. That was actually my wife's idea on putting our dogs in there because it's kind of boring just having a waiting video that's just a moving background. So why not watch something entertaining, right? More dog videos coming. Glad you like them. Good morning, Matia, maybe? Saying hello, following you on Udemy. Thanks for following me on Udemy. Definitely, if you want to see more of the stuff than Udemy, jump on this YouTube channel and subscribe to it, as well as get on my newsletter, because not everything I share on Udemy due to the limits of how many things I can share in emails. So if you're a fan of my Udemy stuff, I'm obviously releasing stuff here on YouTube. I do some Twitch streaming sometimes. So yeah, jump on those things. Eric, congrats on the award. Thank you, Eric. It was a big honor, and I'm very grateful to the community. All those people you saw in that video are my now I feel like are my close friends that I see twice a year at DockerCon, and we all chat online in the Docker community Slack. And if you haven't signed up for that, just I think search around somewhere for Docker community, and you'll find a sign up, and you can jump in that Slack channel, as well as the one that I have for my Docker mastery courses. Victor, thank you. Congrats. Yes, thanks a lot. Matt's saying, what was your overriding emotion when you put that hat on? Matt, it was like having tunnel vision. If you've ever stood in anyone and talked or spoken to a large audience, you lose track of all sense of where you're at, and you can't see anything because there's bright lights, so you just see a sea of nothing. And I'm just glad they didn't ask me to have a speech because I didn't know I was getting it. So I had nothing prepared, and I probably would have fumbled through some, silly, I'd like to thank the Academy kind of stuff. But really it was just being grateful and humbled that I was even considered for that, and that my peers and friends all think that I'm doing stuff that's useful. And looking up, I think, at the screen and seeing your friends talk about you on a 30-foot screen is sort of larger than life and a little bit surreal. And I actually watch the video now, and I have more memories of the video itself than of the actual event, because in those kind of situations, you just get so much tunnel vision, you barely know what's happening. But after it all happened, we took a bunch of selfies, and we all high-fived each other, and I remember all that. So what actually happened at the event is a little fuzzy. But yeah, it was super awesome to get that award. Jacob says, thanks. Yeah, thanks a lot. Samir was wondering what kind of interview questions I should expect for a DevOps position. So that's actually a great question, and something I haven't mentioned in this YouTube yet is my AMA. So I have, obviously this is an AMA, but I have an offline AMA that is over on GitHub, and in there, people ask questions sort of, when I'm not live on YouTube, and there's some questions on there related to DevOps specifically, because this is a common question. And so question 7 on there goes over this topic in detail. So check that out. I just put that in the chat and see if that's helping getting you started, and what tools and techniques and other resources you can use to get started in DevOps, because obviously it can seem a little daunting with so many things that you feel like you need to know. And really just take it one step at a time, one day at a time. It took me years and years. I've been doing this for decades now. So yeah, it's hard to do it overnight. But it's all fun stuff, and good luck. Jacob says, if you're doing an AMA today, I have a question about logging into a private registry on secondary swarm nodes. I frequently get no such image from node 2. I am using stacks with registry auth. Private registry on secondary swarm nodes. Jacob, I don't know. So first question, Jacob, is, so what we're talking about here is if you're in a swarm cluster, if you have private images, that you're having to pull either from Docker Hub or your own registry, you need to have authentication stored inside the service definition. So when you create Swarm services, you would actually have a little -- use registry auth that would add in the credentials essentially into the definition, and that way each server can then download the images it needs to add. If you're having problems with that, the first thing I'm going to say is, what version are you on? Are you on the latest version, 1809 latest version? Always update rather than trying to figure out what that is. I have not had problems with use registry auth failing on other nodes. I might, if that was me and I was troubleshooting, the first thing I'd probably do is restart the Docker daemon on each one of those nodes, one node at a time, just to make sure that I don't have something funky going on with Docker itself. And if you're running fault-tolerant services, hopefully you can do that one node at a time. And other than that, I don't have any immediate stuff. Sometimes when I have different nodes that act weird and they're not healthy from an OS or Docker perspective at the core of Docker, I'm just going to destroy them. Because really in a cluster, the idea is that your servers aren't permanent. They're not, as we call, pets. They don't have specific names. They're not custom built. And they should be more disposable now, because now if you're creating these clusters the way you should, then the nodes can go away and you can spin up new nodes, especially if you're in the cloud and it's easy to spin up VMs, and then just add those nodes back to the cluster, and then everything sort of works its way out. So those are the things that I would try. I wouldn't, using the with registry auth option is the way to do it. So if that's not working, I don't have any clear reason why that's not working, other than maybe they truly can't reach the image. So one thing I will do is I will go to those other nodes and I will do a Docker pull and see if I can't manually pull that image. Sometimes it might be a network path or DNS issues or something else wrong with the server. So I will manually pull those images from each node just to see if that fixes the problem, right? Obviously, that's not a permanent solution, but that's part of what I would troubleshoot. I'd also look at the Docker daemon logs in systemd to, and journald to make sure that my daemon is running and not getting errors about access or stuff like that. You're not going to see anything in your service logs because the service logs are focused on your app, right? And the app hasn't started yet because it can't even pull down the image, so you wouldn't see anything in the service logs, which you probably already have figured that out. Another thing you can look at is the Docker events command, Docker events. That's definitely going to give you detailed what's happening, what's the swarm trying at each moment. It's basically everything that the swarm is doing. And you would need to run that on managers as well as each node that's failing at the images and see if you can't get any more information from that. But good luck with that. Hopefully that helped. All right. Samir says, what is the likelihood of a tough algorithms data structures question on a specific programming language for a DevOps interview? So Samir, I would say on a DevOps interview, if I was going to interview for a job or a client, the first thing I want to do is learn as much as I can about their infrastructure. Because if they're, for example, if they're a shop that is using specific cloud technologies, then I will definitely want to make sure that I've brushed up on those so that I at least am up to date and familiar with what's going on. I would find that different DevOps teams, so DevOps implies dev and ops, right? So some DevOps teams are just people that are really developers that have learned some sysadmin skills, right? So those people are going to be more developer focused. They might expect you to know some languages like Python or node.js, certainly some bash skills, some bash scripting, I would say is sort of in there, basic bash, some basic Python. Usually when you get to DevOps, you have learned a little bit about how each language is deployed as an application, not so much actually how to write in that language, because I'm not a Java programmer, even though I might have taken a course or two over my decades of experience. But I understand, dealing with jar files and how an application is packaged up and deployed for Java, what Spring Boot is, at least at the basics of it, common stuff like that. The same thing goes for .NET. If I have .NET apps, as a DevOps person, I'm going to need to make sure those are properly packaged up and deployed and running, and I might need to monitor them. So I'm going to know some basic stuff about .NET. I'm not going to be a .NET programmer necessarily, but I understand where to go find the dependency files for .NET. I maybe understand how .NET looks to be built with MS Build, something like that. So I would say you don't need to know all those languages, but in your career over time, you'll eventually learn some basics about how each one works and how each one's packaged. I think that's more important than understanding how to develop in those. So I would say that it's pretty rare. This is a long answer to your question, but it's a pretty rare case, I would think, in a DevOps interview to get an algorithm question. That's a pretty unique scenario where that's more of a developer-focused question. If someone's, I like math, but I'm not great at it, and I've never had hard math problems as part of DevOps. That's maybe more focused on someone who's in a scientific role or in a specific, machine learning algorithm type job, which would be in the job description, right? So you would know from the job description the requirements of those things. I tend to tailor, by the way, like everyone else, I tend to tailor my application, my resume to the job, right? Blasting out your resume and all that stuff, it doesn't work. I've never got a job that way. The way that I've always been successful at getting clients in my own freelancing as well as getting jobs is focusing on that job, right? I mean, eventually you're going to get referrals for jobs, and that's great. It's so great when a friend of yours recommends you for a job. But until then, you're going to just have to blindly apply. And the way you stand out is get that cover letter and make that cover letter interesting. Make it about you and your passion for technology. Some of the best people I've hired weren't the most qualified, but they had a passion for learning, and that's one of the big parts of this job is always learning. How do you learn? What's your home lab look like? How do you play with things on the weekends at night or whatever? Because you don't always get time at work to learn all the things you need to learn in this job. And I think it's really important to understand how you learn, because not all of us are good at that, right? So I actually apply more when I'm interviewing someone for a project or a position. I would consider those things more important than maybe that they have the latest technologies all in their brain, right? Because we all have the internet. We can all research problems and discover answers online. To me, it's more important that they have good analysis skills, more troubleshooting skills, that they know how to approach a problem, that sort of thing. And you can put all that in your cover letter and in your resume and focus around that. And then obviously at the end, you could have just a list of tools that you've worked with. Great questions. I like all these DevOps topics tonight about what's going on in your jobs, because ultimately we're all learning this stuff, not just for hobby, but hopefully for our career. And that's important. All right, who's next? Nick's asking, where will the Kube course be released? So if you're on my newsletter, you'll get that announcement. It should be coming out on Udemy. At least the first one is going to come out there. Don't have any plans to release that course somewhere else because Udemy's been great. So George says, yeah, I'd like to subscribe if you release Kate's course. I love the Docker course. Yeah, so sign up. You can actually just go to brettfisher.com/newsletter or just go to my Docker page. Really, any page on my website should have the newsletter link at the top. I don't send it very often. It's only maybe a couple times a month, so it's low frequency, no spam. Yes, George says, please consider to include Helm in the K8's course. I will definitely talk about Helm, and we'll probably have some examples in there. It definitely won't be a full Helm course because that could be its own thing, but most certainly I think that any Kubernetes deployment is going to have Helm in it at this point. So yeah. Samir, what kind of storage class would you suggest in Kubernetes? Are containerized storage a better idea than using Portworx, or would you prefer NFS? So, Samir, I make my storage decisions based on the application and the requirements of my apps. I don't really make those decisions based on orchestration because I'm going to have different requirements for different apps, whether it's I need shared storage, I need SSD local storage maybe. Maybe I can use a block-based storage that's like a EBS in Amazon, or maybe I can use EFS, which is Amazon's NFS solution. Maybe I can do that. But not all things work great over NFS. It is a network protocol, so it's going to affect performance. Maybe your databases won't work well on that, and you'll need more local storage. Maybe you need really super fast as possible storage for a specific app, so you're going to need to use local SSD and then figure out how to back that up somewhere else. So I make those decisions about the app, and then I look at the orchestrator and try to figure out how to add that in the orchestrator. So on any decent size cluster, whether it's Swarm or Kubernetes, you're probably going to end up with multiple types of storage you're dealing with. Now, Portworx solves some problems, but not all problems, right? Using EBS or DigitalOcean's block storage solves some problems, but not all problems. And each storage itself has unique pros and cons, right? EBS on Amazon doesn't do multi-server. It only can talk to one server at a time. So that may not fit all the needs. You might need EFS, which does do multi-server, but it's slower. So pros and cons to all of those things. I think if a super simple solution, I use something on Swarm, I would use something like RexRay that just allows me to connect block storage to whichever node that it needs to run on, and then if it needs to go somewhere else, it'll move. Kubernetes has some of that stuff built out of the box, so you may not need something like an orchestrator like RexRay on top of that. So it's up to you. I think storage is one of those areas, kind of like proxies and service meshes, where everybody's kind of doing their own thing right now. We don't have just one solution for all the things. So yeah, I would say look at your requirements of your apps first, and then start looking at the options of your cloud provider, because obviously that makes a big difference. Are you in your data center? Are you on a specific cloud? Those are going to be the things that are limiting you more than choosing a different piece of software, right? David says, congratulations. Thank you so much. Glad to have you here. I'm very honored to have that award. Aditya says, hello, soon. What's up? What is your take on Docker's recent message? Now the Docker captain in the room. What is your take on Docker's recent message that they're still improving on Swarm mode and have most of their EE customers using that, given all the activity happening in the Kubernetes ecosystem? So this is a question because we hung out last week in Barcelona talking to Docker customers about what they want. And I think it's interesting. One of the theories and predictions I have that's going to happen over the next 3 to 5 years is, Kubernetes is obviously going to have more and more features as it grows as a project. But I also expect it to get simpler. And I think as everyone creates a way to deploy Kubernetes, that us manually deploying our own Kubernetes clusters is not going to be a popular choice. So that's going to take a lot of the complexity, I think, out of deploying Kubernetes. For Swarm, that's one of its sweet spots, right? Swarm is super easy to deploy and manage, but do we even need that? So I love deploying my own Swarm servers because I've always been a sysadmin at heart. I've always been ops-oriented. But I know I talked to a lot of friends that they don't want to deal with servers like that. They would rather the cloud provider manage their servers for them. And so they would rather just, push a button and then have everything ready for them, kind of like what DigitalOcean is doing with Kubernetes and what EKS does. EKS is a little bit more managed than, a little bit more of your own work, but I think DigitalOcean is doing it as easy as possible for now. So really this question is more about where do we see the trends going? One thing I hope doesn't happen in the industry is that we all end up with only one container orchestrator, because I think that Swarm is introducing concepts and ideas around how secure and easy the setup and deployment and management can be. It doesn't have all the features, right? We were talking last week at the Captain Summit around jobs. Swarm doesn't have jobs yet. That would be a great feature, and I really hope Docker adds that in, or someone from the community offers up that pull request. The challenge with jobs, though, is that it could literally be its own app, right? There's so many different things you could throw into jobs and features and knobs and things to do. So I think the challenge has been up till now is like they got to make some decisions around what things they're going to support in a jobs service and what they're not. So what we learned last week was of the 700 customers that Docker has, almost all of those are using Swarm. And you don't hear that in the news, unfortunately, because the news is sort of drowned out by all of the stuff coming out of CNCF and how the Kubernetes project has blown up. And that's all really great stuff, but it gives us sort of a reality distortion, thinking that that's the only thing people are doing. And that's not true, right? There's people still happy with Nomad, and there's lots of people running Mesosphere. I was just reading an article the other day that Mesosphere is really popular in the telecom industry. So I think a lot of these other tools have their own uses, and I think certainly for clusters like Docker Enterprise, which is the only one that I'm aware of that does both Swarm and Kubernetes, that's actually really cool, because we learned last week from several customers that I was talking to. One of them is Docker Captain and Mike Irwin. He was talking about, actually, and Don as well, they were talking about, they started out with Swarm, and they left a lot of stuff in Swarm, and then they only moved stuff to Kubernetes that needs it. Maybe it needs the cron jobs feature and functionality, or some other thing that maybe is more service mesh oriented. And so it needs those things, and those things work better in Kube right now. So it's a weird time to make a decision. And I think mostly if you're a DevOps practitioner, if you're someone who has to make these decisions, my key piece of advice to you is to remain flexible. Don't assume that your stack of tools today is going to be the same stack of tools you're going to be using in 3 years, because this industry is very young, right? Most of these technologies didn't even exist 5 years ago, much less 10 years ago. So I think if Docker keeps investing in Swarm, and they say they are going to, but we really haven't quite seen that yet in terms of big feature releases this year. I'm really hoping 2019 will be that, and we'll see some pretty cool big PRs that show off some new functionality that makes Swarm do more of those things, like maybe more access into the Swarm API, like having more access to tasks, or the Stacks API being a thing, or the jobs, stuff like that, or a first-class volume driver, like maybe RexRay built in, out of the box, maybe as a first-class storage driver. We've got lots of ideas, and the captains are constantly talking about that. So great question, Soon. It's almost like I planted you in there to ask that question. Aditya's back. I want to implement Docker in my company, but my company infrastructure security guys saying they cannot allow us to install Docker because security guys not have visibility of what is installed. How can I convince them with legal documentation? So this is largely around getting, this is not so much a tech thing, right? Getting your company on board with a new technology is always a challenge when you're the tech leader or you have a new idea. This was true 15 years ago, 20 years ago when we all did virtualization. I remember standing in a room, I was working in an enterprise of about 7,000 employees and about 300 people in IT, and I was standing in a room of IT people explaining what virtualization was. Now, you all are using virtualization every day. That's very normal now. But back then, we actually had to show them analogies of mainframe to PC and like holding up hardware and talking about how things have changed. And now we're going to take it one step further and virtualize operating systems on top of the same piece of hardware. That was crazy stuff 15 years ago. We forget that. So containers is the next level. Now today, it would be crazy to think that you're not doing virtualization at some point, right, in your infrastructure. And so security people are very comfortable with virtualization now. At first, they were paranoid about, and rightfully so, that's their job, right? The job of a security engineer is to be paranoid. So I would say give it time, give them resources as much as you can to learn. Hey, send them to my course, right? I'm an ops person that's always been security focused, so I'm put little elements of that into my courses whenever I can to make sure that I'm sort of appeasing the security people. So take that course. I think once they understand the technology, they'll realize that they can see inside of Docker just like they can see in everything else. One of my favorite examples of trying to explain container tech to someone who's an ops person is to just simply go into the shell, right, and hop to a server. And let's see. I'm just going to do this real quick. See what servers I got. So if I just hop onto one, all right. So I've got a 3-node swarm here, and if I just do a Docker PS on this server, this is actually where I'm running my website, right? So I've got multiple containers running. But if I just do a process list, let's see, let's look for node. Let me do this. Yeah. Nope, that's not what I was looking for. What am I running on this machine? So I guess my point here, what is my point? Okay. Why is this not working? Oh, because I'm on my local machine. All right, 1 second. 1 second. I'm figuring this out. Come on. Okay, now let's do this again. So I have a process list on this server, right? If I do a Docker PS, I have 2 containers running. If I do a process list and I grep out node, the node application that's running in a container is still showing on the host because containers aren't virtualization, right? Containers are simply a boundary, a set of boundary restrictions in the kernel that control the application process and limit it from getting anything else out of the system, right? So it has its own little enclave, but it's still a first-class process on the host. If I had to show this to a Linux security engineer that hasn't maybe had a lot of time with containers, they're going to realize, oh, all their tools are still going to work. If they have security analysis tools or monitoring tools, all those tools still work. Now, they may want to have Docker-friendly tools that will show you maybe the list of containers and those layers of abstraction. But these things aren't hidden away inside a container that you can't get to, right? All this stuff is still there. All the files inside of my container are still on this host. They're just hidden, not hidden. They're just in plain view, but they're put in a different place under varlib docker, right? So I can go in here and look at volumes. If I go into overlay 2, I can actually see all the files individually. So if I did some sort of antivirus scan, it would scan all the files from all my containers if I did it on the host. So that really, I think, calms the nerves a little bit. The second thing I do, and you should check out my Ask Me Anything. So if we go back over to that. So remember how I had this question over here of the developer? Well, I have security-related questions, and one of those... Oops. One of those security-related questions is, what security concerns do I have with Docker, right? So this is sort of my argument about what's going on in containers and what you need to concern yourself with. But the quick speech, the elevator speech sort of on that, or elevator pitch, is everything you'd run on a host, if you ran it in a container, by default, it's more secure. And what I mean by that is if you run it in the container, now if that app were to ever get hacked or exposed in some way, it is limited to what it can do inside that container. It can't break out unless there's some zero-day Linux kernel vulnerability, and if that's the case, then we're all in trouble. So when you do Docker by default, when you run Docker, you get out of the box all this stuff. You get seccomp profiles, AppArmor profiles, you get syscall limitations in Linux. You don't get any of that stuff if you just run a regular Linux process. But if you run it in a container, all those things get enabled and turned on. So you suddenly get a huge benefit by taking that same app you're already running and putting it in a container. That really ramps up your security just out of the box. Now, in this post, there's lots of other things that I suggest that you might want to look at. And I take a layered approach to security where I say these are the easy things you can do, and then these are the harder things, and start easy and work your way hard. So maybe learn these things, have more conversations. I would say just talk with them, give them resources. If there's someone who's not willing to talk with you, then, well, you're already kind of in a problem state anyway, because I believe that if you're really doing DevOps, we have this term DevSecOps. I kind of agree with that and don't, because I feel like security is no longer an option. It should be a part of everyone's job. It should be a part of an operator's job, a DevOps job, and a developer's job. And having good relationships with your security team, I think, is important, right? Having meetings with them on an ongoing basis, learning about what they're doing, I think is important. And so I always, in my projects and in my teams, try to make sure that we're bridging those gaps, right? That's the whole reason DevOps existed, is to bridge those gaps between the teams so that we're all working together. I include the security team as a part of that because I think they're very important. And the more they're involved, I typically have a better time working with them, and I get more things approved because they learn to understand the way I think, I learn how they think, and we all start to trust each other. So good luck on that project. I'm glad you asked that question. It's a great question. All right, we've got time for a few more questions, so I'm going to start hitting these rapid fire and see if we can't get through some pretty quick so that nobody's left behind. By the way, if you're still watching live and you've asked a question that I can't get to in the hour, I may stay a little long to try and answer your question, but if I can't, I'm always going to answer it in the chat in YouTube. So hang out in the chat, just leave the browser running if you have to walk away from your desk, and I will answer those in chat after I turn off the recording. I try to make sure that you always get your questions answered, even if I don't have time to stay on the camera, right? Let's see, what's the next one? And Ditya, thanks for, he's just got some more comments. Thanks for taking the course. I'm glad you're a fan. No worries about all the questions. PM says, hey, what is the best way to take snapshot of volume on Swarm? So in Swarm, so there's several things you can do. In any container, all of your volumes, you see this directory I'm in on this machine here, everything is in the volumes. So volumes by default are going to be stored underneath there. On this host, I don't have local volumes because I'm not storing things locally on the host. So I would say backing up or snapshotting is completely dependent on your app. And the sort of the backups and the management of your persistent data in the app, to me, doesn't really change with containers. Maybe the command will be run in a container to do backups, or an exec command, but the process for doing that doesn't change. For example, if I'm doing a database, well, if I'm going to back up that database, like let's say MySQL, I'm going to do a MySQL dump from another container, and I'll probably do it over the network against the database server. And then when I do that, I would bind mount something on persistent storage. So I might, do a Docker service create and create a dedicated service. And I actually give that example in my dog versus cat repo. So if you haven't been to this repo yet, dogvs.cat, because I like domain names, is an example of setting up a swarm. And one of the simple examples, and of course, these are all, I try to make them as simple as possible, but also as real world as possible. So underneath the stack ghost, I have a very simple example of how I would just make a database backup service that would connect. I would just basically change the command at runtime, run my SQL dump over the network against the database, and then mount a different location, preferably on network storage, to store that backup. And I can even use the MySQL password, and I can use that secrets and stuff like that. So I would say that there is no built-in snapshotting of volumes in Docker. That's not a feature out of the box. So I would be looking at exactly what storage I'm using and what app I'm using and come up with a solution for that unique one. I think it's different depending on your use case. Soon ask, also, can you explain the significance of the recent dog versus cat repo update, adding a stack file for traffic reverse proxy? We need to do this next time. You just need to come on the show and we'll do this together. We'll do this over a Zoom meeting or a YouTube live hangout or something. All right, so in this repo, in dog versus cat, which I'm building out examples for Swarm. These are specific to Swarm right now. I would love to do Kubernetes ones as well, but for now, I'm focused on the Swarm stuff. I added a pretty big one. So if you've ever deployed a cluster, especially Swarm, you know that you need a front-end proxy so that you can have many websites. And I'm working, and that's a fairly complicated problem that usually requires more than just some simple little thing to make it work. And so I've created this YAML file. I've actually got two of them. And I started out with a very simple proxy using Traffic. If you're not familiar with Traffic, it is sort of a container native proxy system. And so it's a young project. It's only a few years old, I think, maybe 3 or 4 years old. I'm not sure exactly its age. But it's quite popular now because it's focused on the world of containers where things are spinning up all over the place, all the time, right? We've constantly got containers coming up and down, and how do you constantly keep your proxies, your load balancers, up to date and on the current reality of what's running in your system? And so Traffic does that. And what I've done in this YAML file for stacks is trying to create a one-stop shop for the sort of an easy button for proxying on Swarm. And in here, like for example, this service does a one-shot configuration of traffic and stores it in console, which is a key value store. So that actually starts and then it finishes and then stops and doesn't run again. Traffic here is the major application, and in this one, I've updated it so that it doesn't have to run on managers, which is key because I like in larger clusters to make everything that's front end, ingress coming from the internet is running in a DMZ, hopefully of some sort. And I want to put my workers out there and keep my managers protected. And so this does that. And it allows me to run it in global mode, which means that there'll be a proxy running on each of my servers that I need to constrain it to. And then I have the console backend, which stores the configuration. And then I have something called the Docker socket proxy. I didn't actually come up with this idea, and it's a pretty great idea. So this allows us to run the manager, not have to run traffic on managers, because it takes the Docker socket, which proxies need access to get data about what's running in Swarm, and it creates a limited subset of functionality from the API of Docker and puts that on the network so that only the traffic front end can get to it. So you put it on its own secure IPsec overlay network, and then you only enable the features that you need. And right now, I'm actually in the middle of testing whether or not this works, which it has worked for the last, I played with it yesterday and it works great. So if you're someone who's playing with Swarm, learning Swarm, and you want to take it to the next level, if you're taking my Swarm course, there's more and more stuff going into this repo, and I definitely recommend you check it out. I improved the documentation yesterday, so the README has been a little bit more updated with what's going on, step by step, going through each step, building out your cluster. And then I just did another talk on it at DockerCon again. This is the talk from the summer. I have another one that just happened at DockerCon Barcelona, and I'll be updating with that too. So great question. Who's next? Incredible advice, Samir. Thank you. Thanks for watching. I'm preparing for a data orchestration DevOps engineer interview coming up, and I've been preparing LEET code and linear algebra graph theory. So this is useful to know to change my focus. Yeah, I mean, those are all really interesting things for very specific jobs, right? That may need you to have that kind of level, but I've never needed to know that stuff for any of the DevOps jobs I do. But my jobs are more, the things I work on are more generic, right? Developers give me apps. I figure out how to run them in the cloud on clusters, quickly in an ever-increasing pace. Let's see, Nick. Thanks, Brett. I sent out a tweet to DigitalOcean. Hope they will sponsor your channel. Thanks, Nick. I actually know some of the team there. They've been great. They've taken care of me. I actually got in New York City. I got to walk through their offices, which is a pretty cool office to work at. Actually, they have lots of cool stuff there. Very much that startup vibe, but also lots of people. And lots of stuff. So it doesn't feel like you're just working on a picnic bench, but it's still very cool there. They have beer in the break room. That's cool. Let's see. Samir, how important is it to know Python very well for automation of DevOps? That's a great question. I am not a Python guru. I'm more of a node.js guy and a bash guy. So I would say that it all depends on the job. If you're trying to apply for a job, then this is a great example of also asking the question of, do I need to know Puppet or Chef or Ansible? And that's all depending on the job you're going for. I would say that all these things eventually you would have some experience with, some Python scripting, some, if you're going to do, Ruby's for Chef and a little bit in Puppet, so you might need to know some Ruby. But that's all depending on the job. So I would look at the jobs you're trying to apply for, because we're not all qualified for all DevOps jobs, right? There's just too much stuff out there to know. The same thing with engineering jobs or just dedicated ops jobs. There's too much to learn. As just someone who runs cloud systems, there's too much for me to learn between Azure, Amazon, DigitalOcean, and all the others. There's just too much tech there for me to possibly know all the things. And so you have to just make a decision about what am I going to learn next? and always be learning, right? I'm always taking courses, I'm always reading blog articles, I'm always playing with things. That's in my blood as an engineer, as DevOps, is that I've got a never-ending list of things to learn. I would say that Python is probably more important to know than other traditional languages, but I have been able to get away in my career with a limited subset of a full Python programmer's knowledge, mostly because I'm not trying to do scientific data analysis, machine learning, stuff like that, where they're maybe more focused on the Python realm. And I tend to solve things more with infrastructure as code tools so that I'm not writing so many scripts anymore. I'm using things like Terraform and Ansible, SaltStack, for example, Docker, orchestrators, AWS tools, CloudFormation, right? All these things, they're more about learning the tool and then understanding YAML and less about writing a bunch of stuff in Python. So if I walked into a shop that was DevOps oriented and everything was in Python, well, obviously I'm going to want to know it in order to get a job with that team. But I also would think that they would be transitioning a lot of that because that is maybe the older stuff that we had to do back in the day before we had all these great infrastructure tools. And now as we all get to the infrastructure as code mindset, that we don't hand create a lot of script. But you're always going to need some scripting. I try to go with Bash first because it works everywhere. But Python is also a really great one as well. So it's really up to the job, up to you. John, thanks soon. Hope to see you soon. John, hello. Could you please tell me more about your experience in setting up PKI as well as about its implementation in the Docker Swarm? So John, PKI, so for those that aren't familiar, public key encryption, I believe is the acronym. And it is been around for decades and decades, and we use it every day. If you're not familiar with PKI, it's what allows us to use certificates in our browser, where you have a public certificate that is presented to users that come to your website, and then you have a private certificate on your web server. That's how PKI works. So, John, I'm assuming what you're asking me is how does Docker Swarm use certificates itself for its own management? And out of the box, that is something where when you create a swarm, Docker does several things in the background. It actually creates a root certificate and stores it on that first server inside the Swarm database, the Raft log, as we call it. And then it will create a public-private key pair for each node that it adds to the Swarm. And it'll manage those. It manages their expiration. You can actually rotate those keys very easily. You can even do that from the command line. It's pretty great, actually. You can do like a Docker Swarm and look at the help, and you can see other things like in just the CA area, you can see that you can actually do things like rotate certificates, which I don't know. If you're a PKI person, that's pretty fantastic. The guys that actually did that, they're no longer at Docker, but they've moved on to other startups. But the team that did that, when I saw the first demo, I thought, man, if only every PKI tool allowed a one-liner to completely replace all the certificates on all the nodes. How great would that be, in case you have concerns that maybe your root was exposed? So that stuff is all built in out of the box with Swarm. You don't necessarily need, I don't have any customers or anyone that's really using their own PKI to deploy Swarm, but you can do that. You can provide an enterprise PKI intermediate certificate to your Swarm. I've never done it because I don't know that I see the advantages to that necessarily. We'd have to have a discussion around exactly what you're getting out of that, other than just a whole lot more work and effort in those certificates, because you don't see those certificates anywhere, right? Those certificates aren't used in your apps. They're not used to deploy container websites or anything like that. So if that's what you're asking about, hopefully I answered that question. If you're talking more on the app side of PKI and managing your own, website certificates, you would use Docker secrets to store those, and it encrypts the database on disk so that your SSL certificates are protected, and they're never stored on disk unencrypted. They're only put on the nodes that they're needed, and they're stored in memory on a TempFS in memory. And then when they are no longer needed on that server, Swarm actually removes it so that node no longer has access to that secret. So hopefully I've answered both sides of that coin, both just for the management and for using PKI as a regular app. All right, we're going to wrap this up. We're after 12 o'clock, and we have one more question. I'll try to get to this. Abdul says, hello, sir. How to make a career in Docker and Kubernetes? Where to start? So perfect answer to the perfect question for the end of this. The first one I would say is go to my Docker resources and take my Docker course. I designed my Docker mastery course for someone new to containers, right? It does require that you know some Linux basics and some command line basics. So you definitely should have some understanding of operating systems and networks and generally how the cloud works. But you don't need to know a whole lot more than that. There's actually requirements listed in that course on the main page, and those that will get you the coupons you need to buy the courses for super cheap. And so I would start there. And typically my learning path for new people is to learn Docker, then learn Swarm, and then if you still need it, learn Kubernetes. If you are just joining me, my Kubernetes course is coming out next year after I release my Docker for Node.js course here pretty soon. And so hopefully, eventually, I'll have a nice full learning path from learning Docker, learning Swarm, learning Kubernetes. And like I said earlier, the reason I have people learn Swarm first is because the concepts are much easier to understand. And I feel like eventually we all need to learn multiple tools, right? In every layer of your stack, learning multiple tools is key for your progress in your career. You know, there's a saying that when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think that's also true in containers and container technology, that if we only know one tool, then the only way we know how to solve a problem is with that tool. So I think eventually what I hope people do is that they learn multiple orchestrators and multiple container tools and see whether or not they want one or the other. For instance, maybe go check out Containerd instead of Docker. Now, Docker actually runs on top of Containerd. That's going to be a whole topic we can talk about next time. But if you check out the Containerd project, it's a simpler version of Docker, essentially, that doesn't do all the things Docker does, but you might consider running it out of the box in case you don't need all the tools that Docker provides. So learning some of these tools doesn't mean you're going to necessarily use them all, but it at least allows you to understand and compare different tools and know when to use the right ones, right? Because Docker, things like Docker, Swarm, Kubernetes, all these tools, they're not the only way to solve the problem, and you shouldn't use them every single place that you do your stuff, right? Each one of these tools has their own pros and cons. So as you learn your tooling, I would say learn one tool and then move on, and then later come back and learn a comparative tool, right? You don't necessarily need to know multiple orchestrators on day one. Just knowing one orchestrator or one container runtime is good enough. And then as you mature, maybe next year your goal is to learn another one, and so that you can understand them. So I hope that these questions helped you, these answers rather, helped your questions. I'm glad you showed up today. Make sure you subscribe, click the bell so that you get notifications on when I go live next week. And look for more YouTube videos here coming soon, and my new Node course when it comes out in hopefully a couple of weeks to maybe a month. I'm not really sure the release date yet, but you'll get an announcement if you're on my newsletter, which you can sign up on my website. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on the internet.